story begins in an operating room where Dr. Margaret Sullivan and her team are about to perform a critical surgery. Their patient, Brendan Hayes, has a horrifying, segmented object moving beneath the tissue of his chin, a condition that defies medical explanation. The narrative then flashes back 3 weeks to a typical Sunday morning with Brendan and his family in Nashville, while repairing a rotten fence in intense heat. A rusty nail from the wood snapped loose and slashed Brendan across the chin. The injury was deep and bled immediately, setting in motion the chain of events that led to the life-threatening crisis in the operating room. After a rusty nail slashed his chin, Brendan Hayes treated the deep wound with a dirty rag and a cheap bandage. Unbeknownst to him, a fly laid eggs on the bandage. His wife, Sarah, a nurse, grew concerned and made him promise to seek medical attention if the inflammation worsened. Over the next day, Brendan ignored increasing signs of infection, including swelling and a strange, sweet odor. He dismissed the symptoms and his wife's worries, attributing the sensations to normal healing. Despite Sarah's professional concern, Brendan insisted he was fine. Refusing proper care and setting the stage for a severe medical crisis, Brendan's condition worsened dramatically. He awoke from nightmares of flies, and by Tuesday, Sarah noticed a dark spot in the wound, triggering her fear of melanoma due to her mother's history. A neighbor, Tom, warned Brendan about the risk of botfly larvae in the hot, humid weather, but Brendan dismissed him. That evening, Brendan discovered the infection had spread far beyond Sarah's marker, with swelling, discoloration, and drainage. He even saw a slight, unsettling movement under his skin. Despite this, he chose not to seek medical help because the cost of urgent care would mean missing their mortgage payment. The story ends with Sarah discovering blood on his pillow, signaling the crisis is escalating. Sarah discovered Brendan's wound had severely worsened overnight, with red streaks indicating a systemic infection. A heated argument ensued, where Brendan confessed he was avoiding medical care because the cost would mean missing their mortgage payment. Sarah, terrified he would die like her mother who delayed treatment for cancer, broke down. The confrontation was witnessed by their children, whose distress finally broke Brendan's resistance. He agreed to go to urgent care by noon. At work, Brendan felt increasingly ill with fever and dizziness, and his coworker confirmed his condition looked critical, forcing him to face the seriousness of his situation. Brendan went to urgent care, where a physician's assistant quickly diagnosed him with a common bacterial infection, cellulitis, and prescribed antibiotics. The visit and medication cost $235, leaving them unable to pay their mortgage. Sarah expressed concern about a dark spot in the wound, fearing it could be melanoma like her mother had, but the PA dismissed it as a bruise. Despite a gut feeling that the diagnosis was wrong, Sarah felt powerless to question the medical professional's judgment. The family was left in a precarious financial and medical situation. To cover the mortgage after the medical expenses, Sarah had to borrow money from her sister, deepening Brendan's humiliation. Initially, the antibiotics seemed to work. Brendan's fever broke and the inflammation reduced, making him feel vindicated in his initial hesitation. However, this improvement was dangerously misleading. The antibiotics were only treating a secondary bacterial infection. The real threat, fly larvae that had hatched inside the wound, remained untouched and continued to grow. While Brendan celebrated his recovery, the larvae were actively feeding on his tissue, setting the stage for a much more severe medical crisis. The story highlights the tragic irony of a treatment that masks a deeper, growing problem. Despite initial improvement from the antibiotics, Brendan's condition deteriorated. He dismissed a neighbor's concern and ignored new symptoms, including a strange fluttering sensation under his skin. While working, he was hit by a sudden wave of dizziness, and later observed a disturbing rippling movement beneath his bandage. By the afternoon, the swelling had returned worse than ever, and his skin had a purple, mottled appearance. A panicked call to his wife revealed the antibiotics had failed, forcing him to confront the terrifying reality that his infection was far more serious than diagnosed. After a panicked call from his wife, Sarah, Brendan returned home from work. She discovered his wound had severely worsened, the swelling increased, red streaks had spread, a foul discharge was present, and his fever had returned to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite Sarah's insistence they go to the emergency room immediately, Brendan resisted, terrified of the high cost. They struck a tense compromise to monitor the condition overnight. However, Brendan was jolted awake from a horrific nightmare to an even worse reality. He felt unmistakable alien movement beneath the skin of his chin, confirming their worst fears that something was alive and growing inside the wound. The crisis escalated when Brendan and Sarah saw undeniable, rippling movement beneath the skin of his chin, confirming something was alive inside the wound. His fever spiked to 102.1 degree Fahrenheit and he began shaking with chills. As Sarah insisted they go to the hospital immediately, Brendan collapsed and suffered a violent seizure. Their children witnessed the horrifying event, Paramedics arrived, and a seasoned EMT named Rick Morrison maintained professional composure until he removed the bandage and saw the moving wound, at which point his expression changed, indicating the severity of the situation. The family's private nightmare had become a full-blown medical emergency. The paramedics' shock upon seeing Brandon's wound confirmed the severity of the situation. In the ambulance, Brandon drifted in and out of consciousness, apologizing for not seeking help sooner. While Sarah was consumed by guilt for not forcing him to go to the hospital, at the emergency room, doctors initially dismissed the possibility of a parasitic infection, suggesting the movement under Brandon's skin was likely gas from anaerobic bacteria. Despite Sarah's insistence that something was alive in the wound, the doctors remained skeptical but ordered a CT scan to investigate the unusual presentation. The family's nightmare continued as medical professionals struggled to grasp the true nature of the horrifying condition. The hospital's billing department presented Sarah with a demand for payment for the $2,800 CT scan she had desperately authorized. She signed the form, her hand trembling not from the financial strain, but from a cold, creeping dread. That scan, however, had revealed the shocking, horrific truth. Brandon's swollen chin was not harboring a simple bacterial infection. The images showed a seething mass of at least 50 insect larvae, a nightmarish colony thriving in the tissue of the man she loved. The radiologist and the consulting physicians confirmed the diagnosis with grim finality: myiasis. It was a parasitic infestation where fly maggots were actively feeding on his living tissue. The antibiotics from the urgent care clinic had been useless, merely treating a secondary bacterial issue while allowing the primary invaders to grow undetected and unchecked. Dr. Sullivan, the surgical attending, took one look at the scans and recognized the profound severity. She immediately began preparing for emergency surgery, explaining to Sarah in a calm, urgent tone that every hour of delay exponentially increased the risk of permanent nerve damage, systemic sepsis, or worse. Dr. Sullivan then led Sarah into a small, quiet consultation room. She pointed to the ghostly images on the light board, where the outlines of at least 45 to 50 larvae were clearly visible, their pale forms a stark invasion against the darkness of Brandon's jaw. She explained how the antibiotics had been a tragic misdirection, masking the true horror. The only option now was immediate, high-risk surgery. The procedure carried the threat of permanent facial paralysis due to the larvae's proximity to critical nerves, and the estimated cost was a staggering $40,000. The weight of the decision, the risk to Brandon's life and face, the crushing financial blow, landed on Sarah with physical force. After a tearful, frantic goodbye with a heavily sedated Brandon, Sarah signed the consent forms, her signature a desperate act of faith. In the operating room, the surgery began. The moment the scalpel made the first incision, a foul-smelling fluid burst forth, a nauseating mix of pus and the acidic byproducts of the larvae's digestion. The stench confirmed the severity of the infestation before the team even saw it. The medical team now faced the grim, meticulous task of manually extracting each parasitic invader, one by one, from the man they were fighting to save. The initial incision revealed a sight that made even the most seasoned members of the surgical team recoil: dozens of white, segmented fly larvae writhed in a grotesque mass within the cavity, their bodies feeding on the inflamed and necrotic tissue. A collective, stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady beep of the monitors. Suppressing their shock, the team fell into a methodical rhythm. With painstaking care, they used fine-tipped forceps to pluck each wriggling larva from its foul nest, dropping them one by one with a soft, sickening plink into a sterile specimen container. A nurse kept a silent tally, her face a mask of professional composure. The most critical moment of the procedure arrived when Dr. Sullivan identified a large, mature larva nestled deep within the tissue, its body positioned perilously close to the delicate branching of the facial nerve. One wrong move could result in permanent paralysis. The room seemed to hold its breath as she worked with microscopic precision, her hands steady as she maneuvered the forceps around the vital structure. For several tense minutes, the only sound was the hum of the operating lights and the soft, focused instructions she murmured to her team. Then, with a final, careful tug, the larva was free. A collective, quiet exhale of relief swept through the room. A major victory had been won in the high-stakes procedure. In total, the surgical team extracted 47 maggots from the wound, followed by the meticulous removal of dozens of glistening, rice-like eggs that had yet to hatch. But the battle was not over. Dr. Sullivan then faced the task of debridement, carefully cutting away the significant amount of dead and infected tissue that the larvae had left in their wake. This left a large, open wound that gaped in Brandon's chin. It was intentionally not stitched closed. Instead, it was packed with sterile gauze, a necessary measure to prevent the wound from sealing over any remaining infection and to allow it to heal slowly from the inside out. A visual testament to the devastation that had been lurking beneath the surface, Brendan was moved to the recovery ward, where a pale and trembling Sarah was shown the horrifying evidence, a specimen jar containing the ghastly contents removed from her husband's body. He was then transferred to the ICU for close observation, a fragile figure dwarfed by tubes and beeping monitors. The story seemed to reach a fragile conclusion when their children, Emma and Noah, arrived. Their faces a mixture of relief and shock as they saw their father for the first time, alive, but swathed in bandages, looking decades older. The immediate crisis appeared to be over, but the long, arduous road to physical and psychological recovery was only just beginning. Then came the final, devastating turn. After the seemingly successful surgery that had extracted 47 maggots, Sarah, emotionally exhausted, returned home for a few hours to shower and gather strength. In the sterile quiet of the ICU, a nurse conducting a routine wound check noticed a subtle, unsettling movement. Peeling back the dressing with careful hands, she made a horrifying discovery. 5 newly hatched larvae, tiny and pale, writhed in the depths of the incision, a pocket of the infestation missed during the major operation. When Brendan was lucid enough to understand that the nightmare was not over, a primal panic seized him. His heart monitor screamed in alarm as he thrashed against the restraints, his cries a raw sound of utter despair. He had to be sedated heavily to prevent him from harming himself. Dr. Sullivan was called back for an emergency bedside procedure, a grim and frantic effort to eradicate this last, hidden clutch. Sarah returned to the hospital to find the scene in chaos. When a nurse gently explained what had happened, the last of her composure shattered. She slid down the wall in the brightly lit hallway, sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of it. Will it ever end? She cried out to no one, her voice echoing with a profound hopelessness. When does it stop? Her neighbor Tom, who had driven her back, knelt beside her, a steadying hand on her shoulder. He offered no empty platitudes, only a shared, heavy silence. In that moment, the tragic theme of the entire ordeal crystallized. Brendan's initial pride, his stubborn refusal to seek help for a small problem, had been the seed. That single choice had germinated in the darkness of neglect, flowering into this catastrophic, recurring trauma. It was a brutal lesson in how a moment of fear can spiral into a prolonged nightmare, and how the refusal to be vulnerable can ultimately lead to the most profound kind of helplessness. Following the shocking discovery and removal of the 5 newly hatched larvae, a final, nightmarish revelation after the major surgery, Dr. Sullivan implemented the most stringent of protocols. The wound was inspected with a magnifying lens every 4 hours under the brightest of lights, the medical team holding a collective breath each time. After a full 24 hours of clear, unequivocal examinations, Dr. Sullivan finally allowed herself to relax her guard. She cautiously declared the active infestation over, her voice carrying the weight of a hard-won battle. But the story of Brendan's ordeal is more than a medical horror story. It is a stark parable about the true nature of strength. In his desperate attempt to be strong, to project an image of unshakable competence and avoid being a burden, he nearly destroyed everything he held dear, his health, his peace of mind, and the very family he sought to protect. His silence became a toxin more dangerous than any parasite. The true resolution, the real healing, began not in the operating room but in the moment he finally surrendered his pride. It was found in the steadfast support of his community, in the unwavering vigilance of his neighbor, Tom, who refused to look the other way, in the medical team's expertise, and in his family's fierce, forgiving love. He learned that true strength is not the absence of need, but the courage to acknowledge it. It is the resilience found in interconnection, not in solitary endurance. Brendan's experience stands as a challenge to us all. It asks a simple, profound question in our own lives. Where does pride keep us silent? What pain do we hide, believing it makes us strong, when in reality it only isolates us? The bravest step we can take is often not to endure alone, but to reach out and say, I need help. For it is in that vulnerability that we find our greatest strength, and our truest community. That's all about our stories. Do you have any thoughts after hearing the story? Please share it in the comments below.